Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, a year in the life of a Churchill polar bear, presented by NatHab expedition leaders Eleanor Eddy and Edye Savage. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Over to you, Eleanor.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks everybody for tuning in today and joining myself and Eddy to talk about polar bears, one of our favorite topics to talk about. Today, Eddy and I really want to share some stories from the last 12 months of our time viewing polar bears in Churchill, Manitoba, and we'll start off with a few introductions here, and I'll ask Eddy to introduce himself first.
Hi, folks. Thanks, Eleanor. So great to be here and talk to you today about the past year of polar bears in Churchill and where they're at coming up in the next few months. To give you a bit of an introduction about myself, if I've met you before, nice to see you again. Thanks for joining. If not, my name is Edye Savage. I've been a Natural Habitat Adventures expedition leader since 2016. I currently, in the past, and I am running their polar bear trips, their Northern Lights trips, the beluga whales, Churchill summer trips, as well as the Switzerland trips, wild side of China trips, and their Iceland trips. And I'm a photo guide on those as well. So that's a bit about me, and over to you, Eleanor.
Thanks, Eddy. So my name is Eleanor, and again, if you've been with us before, thanks very much for coming back. Like Eddy, I spend a lot of my year with Natural Habitat in Churchill, running the beluga whale trips in the summer, the polar bear trips in the fall, and the Northern Lights trips in the winter. And then I'm also involved in our Whales and Trails of Quebec programs and our North Australia programs. So really happy to come at you today with some of the stories from this year. And as we go through the stories, Eddy and I want to be bringing in some of the science and what's happening behind the scenes in that year of a polar bear's life as we weave in those stories from what we've been able to observe this past year as well.
Sounds good. So folks, I guess we'll just get started with, we're going to have several slides here that kind of describe this year in the life of a polar bear for the Western Hudson Bay. So let's get ourselves caught up to summer. We're going to start with March, April, and May. So at this time of year, mothers with newborn cubs are typically leaving their dens. Waputsk National Park and the Churchill Wildlife Management Area, home to basically one of the highest densities of denning female polar bears anywhere on the planet. When those cubs reach, around 25 to 40 pounds, or typically when the ring seal pups, which you can see in that slide there, that little ring seal on the ice there, when those pups have been born and are in their birthing layers, that's also about the timing that females with their cubs start to head out. So that's usually kind of late February and March when they head out onto the ice to begin hunting for those seals. They are joining all of the other bears. All other demographics of bears are already on the sea ice during that time, and they'll be also partaking in the feeding on ring seal pups, as well as ring seal adults, of course. When we get towards kind of April, May, this is when mating begins, and it's typically when females with 2.5-year-old cubs will wean their cubs. So if you look at the bottom right picture there, where you have two bears standing, we see their butts standing together. The bear on the right is the mother. The bear on the left is a roughly 23-month-old male cub. And so you can see that at 23 months old, that cub is pretty much the size of its mom. It doesn't have too much more growing to do before it does surpass its mom in size. And usually kind of after when the 2.5-year mark hits, or around April, May, out on the sea ice, that's when mom will wean their cubs. Weaning can be a quick process or a long and drawn out process. Sometimes it occurs when a male bear comes over and is interested in mom and will actually chase the cubs away. Other times it will be mom saying it's time to, pack up your things, move out of the house, go get a place of your own. You can't live in the basement anymore. And she'll basically forcibly push that cub away so that they're no longer together, at which point she'll go back into estrus. These females that no longer have 2.5-year-old cubs basically will then be available and not necessarily searching, but they'll be available for mating. And so The mating process is over several months out on the sea ice, where male bears are typically seeking out female bears. And if you look in that middle picture at the bottom there, you've got a male with a whole bunch of scarring on his face. You can see he's much larger than the bear in the front in that middle picture, who doesn't have very many scars on their face. And so there is competition among males at any given breeding season. There's typically 3 males that are available for each female that's available for breeding, and that's because the other, the ratio of male to female bears is pretty much 1 to 1. The other 2 of every 3 females are with cubs. Either they're with cubs of the year, or they're with yearling cubs. And so there's only 1 female who has recently weaned her cubs and is available for breeding with the male. So males will fight each other on the ice at times in competition for access to a breeding female. And that kind of takes us to the end of March, April, and May. And we'll talk about sparring a little bit, but sparring is something that those bears will do, where they start throwing the male bears will do on the ice. They'll start throwing their paws and swatting each other, and they can get claws and teeth and all kinds of stuff all over the front half of that polar bear. So then continuing on to kind of June, July, and August, what are the bears doing? Mating season concludes in June at some point. Ice coverage also begins to decrease on the Hudson Bay, so we're starting to get into longer days. Temperatures are beginning to rise, and the ice begins to decrease in June. And typically by late June or early July, most of the Western Hudson Bay population of polar bears are back onto land. When they come off the ice, like I said, usually by mid-July, they begin what we call kind of their resting and fasting phase. So they've pretty much had their ring seal meals or their high calorie, high fat content buffet for the last 6 months they've been on the ice. And now that they're back on land, it is about energy conservation. And so they're resting, they're fasting, usually out towards the coast. And Eleanor, I'm sure we'll talk about that as we see some of her pictures and hear some of her stories, but usually out towards the coast where it's a lot cooler. Temperatures I've experienced myself in Churchill in the summertime are upwards of 80 degrees, depending on the direction of the wind and the intensity of the sun, but it can be pretty intense. And so the bears will often try to find ways to cool down and rest and conserve calories, because the next seal meal that they're going to get will not be until kind of the last week of November, or somewhere in that range. So, but we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get through the presentation. Yeah, and with that, Eleanor, would you like to take over?
All right, thanks. Oops, thanks, Eddy. Before I start talking about some of the summer stories, you may think to yourself, how many stories can there be if all that they're doing in the summer is resting? And I'm here to tell you that there are some cool things that bears do in the summer as well, and they're well worth looking at. And in terms of where Eddy and I are talking about, the experiences that we're going to be talking about are centered around the town of Churchill, where Natural Habitat Adventures does most of its polar bear viewing. So on the left-hand image there, you can see a map of central Canada, and that star that's located pretty well directly in the middle of that left-hand map is where the town of Churchill is located. It's in the province of Manitoba, where I am physically located right now, where my home is, and it can be accessed only by air or by rail or by boats. There is no road network that takes you all the way up to Churchill. On our trips, we fly into Churchill, and if you're there for the fall polar bear season, as Eddy will be talking about later, we tend to go out from Churchill to do our viewing within the wildlife management area that we'll talk about in a bit more detail in a second. And in the summer, when you come up for that time, we also go into that polar bear habitat as shown on that right-hand map. But of course, we spend time on the water as well. So moving into our next slide, I'm just going to show you a little bit more detail of what that polar bear habitat is, because it's centered around an area that Eddy has already mentioned, which is the Wapusk National Park. So as that comes up, you're going to see a green area. That is Wapusk National Park. It's one of Canada's newer national parks, and it's been set aside not as a national park like you might know Banff and Jasper for a lot of human recreation, but actually as a conservation space for those denning female polar bears, where they have to go in, excavate that maternity den, and actually give birth and spend the first couple of months of their newborn's life within those dens. So that area is set aside, and you can see that green area really stretches out all along the coast there into that prime denning habitat. The town of Churchill is that little black dot up on the top left-hand side of that map. And then the kind of salmon or pinky colored between those two things is an area called a wildlife management area. This is still a managed area. It's still set aside for conservation purposes, but some commercial activities are permitted. And that is where we do the bulk of our polar bear viewing activities. Now, that's true in the summer. We go out there as well in the same kinds of vehicles that he's going to show you in the fall. But in the summer, a lot of our activities are more focused on beluga whale viewing. And we actually will often view bears from the coast itself while we are out in boats viewing the beluga whales. So when Eddie's talking here about what those months in a polar bear's life looks like, we wanted to bring in some context for what this year looked like for those bears. On the left-hand side, you can see a map of Hudson Bay. That is that sea ice habitat that those bears are spending as much time as they can on, because that sea ice is their platform for hunting ring seals and all their other foods. Each one of those colored dots on the Hudson Bay is a tracked polar bear. So it's a bear with either a satellite collar or an ear tag that allows scientists to be able to pinpoint their location about once per day or so. And you can see on that map that all of those bears are clustered on what looks like a very small light portion of the bay. That is the ice that was remaining in early July of 2022, so early this year. This was a good year for the polar bears in terms of how much ice was left available. As Eddie was saying, usually by mid-July or so, all the bears are off. Here is mid-July. Almost all those bears were still on. And in terms of who will use that ice as it starts to break up, it does select by sex a little bit. The mothers with cubs will come off the ice earlier. They don't like to swim as far. They're less tolerant of broken up ice. And we often see males remaining on the ice longer. And you can see in the satellite image on that right-hand side what that ice looks like as it's actually physically there right off the bay. So far as what we're usually there to see in the summer, I mentioned before, our summer trips do focus on beluga whale viewing. In the summer months, we'll have around 3,000 beluga whales come into the Churchill River estuary that's located just beside the town of Churchill, Manitoba. They are gorgeous whales. I know Eddie will agree with me that, well, he better agree with me that they're one of his favorite whales too.
They're gorgeous.
Thumbs up from Eddie.
Yeah.
Beautiful whales, so fun to view. They have such inquisitive faces, and we're often lucky enough to get pretty close views at them, even just from the Zodiac boats that we're out with. And while we're out there and we're out there viewing whales, whales are not all that we're necessarily going to be seeing. So when we are out there viewing whales, you can see here, this is the Churchill River, and you can see those white whales right in the river. And if you look behind the whales, onto the rocks, you might notice that some of the rocks are slightly different colors. Some are older rocks, some rocks have more lichen. And then there's a rock in the foreground that looks kind of whitish in color. There are lots of rocks around Churchill that look whitish in color. This rock is actually a sleeping bear. So in the summer, while we might see bears from a bus or from a car or from a polar rover, we're often going to be seeing these bears from the water when we are out on boats doing beluga whale viewing. And these bears will be doing exactly what bears should be doing in the summer a lot of the time, which is conserving their energy. So this is a good resting bear. This particular bear was resting at an area sometimes called Eskimo Point. It's a polar bear resting area just north of a National Historic Site. This National Historic Site is one that you don't get to in any other time of the year besides the summer, because it's not accessible again by road, only by boat. And you get there by taking a boat across the Churchill River to the opposite side of the river. And it's called the Prince of Wales Fort. That Prince of Wales fort is located on the northern tip of the land. But here, if you look at this image, we're looking north over the fort towards Hudson Bay. You can see that there's a spit of land that juts out from the Prince of Wales fort, and that is Eskimo Point. That is, as I mentioned, a designated polar bear resting area. What does that mean when you see it on a map? Well, obviously polar bears can't read, right? But it is an area where if there are bears around town or bears around this National Historic Site, they'll be encouraged to go to that area and just spend their time there where nobody's going to be hassling them. And in fact, polar bear resting area is indeed a great place for polar bears to rest. You may see bears sprawled out in the sun. You may see bears curled up in the rocks. Sometimes bears will even excavate a little day bed where they're reaching down towards cooler soil underneath that top layer that's been warmed by the sun, because these bears are coming off the ice at the heaviest point of their annual cycle. They've been eating ring seals for months and months. They've packed on as many pounds as they can, and they may be coming off the ice with easily an extra 500 pounds of weight that then they need to carry around. Imagine wearing an extra 500 pounds and how hot you'd be in the sunlight. That's exactly how the polar bears feel as well. And so we see them often on the rocks, sprawled out in the greenery, just resting and trying to conserve as much of that extra mass as they can, as well as honestly just taking a rest. They have a long winter cycle that they go through. So in this next slide that's going to come up, you'll see some more greenery. If you've ever wondered, does the Arctic get green? Does it ever get green around Churchill? Like in some of the pictures Eddy's going to show you, it looks very brown and gray. I assure you, in that summer month, sometimes it feels like just 1 month. In those summer months, there is a lot of greenery, and the bears enjoy it just as much as we do. Now, this bear here was a mother and a cub. Next image that Eddy just popped up is also a mom and cub. And while bears are prioritizing rest, there is sometimes not a lot of rest to be had if you have a cub. So one of our favorite bears that we were viewing this summer was this little cub who was out there with his mom on Eskimo Point. This was a really great bear. Couple of bears, they hung around pretty well all the way through the summer months on Eskimo Point, and they were often in an area where we could see them. Now, this is a mom on the left-hand side and her koi on the right. And then on the next slide, you're going to see them in the water. So these bears were not the only bears that were out on Eskimo Point. It's a fairly small spit of land, but there were usually 4 or 5 bears out every single day. And most of the time, those bears were just lying around resting. But this mom with her cub, this cub is what we call a koi or a cub of the year, would have been born early 2022. This was a very rambunctious cub and demanded a lot of time and energy and attention from its mother. So this one here was a really common way we saw them. This is one of the beaches along Eskimo Point, and you might be able to tell that along the water line there's a darker piece of ground. That is in fact not ground. This was a washed up beluga whale carcass. We don't know what took out the whale, but we know that anytime you've got 3,000 animals coming into an area and they're calving and they're at all different age classes, we do expect over the course of the summer to have 1 or 2 whales wash up somewhere. This one was in a very convenient location for viewing, and this mom and cub spent a lot of time with this carcass, well beyond the point where it was picked over for pretty well everything tasty. And on this next image, I think you'll really get a sense for how good the condition was of these bears coming off the ice. Look at that mom on the right. Look at her belly and look at how her back just slopes up towards her rear. This is the classic light bulb on legs form that we look for from a polar bear. She is carrying a lot of fats. And that cub is also pretty pudgy. So she has clearly done a really good job collecting seals and finding food for them both to eat. Which is great because I tell you, this little cub was burning it off. Uh, they would interact with the other bears that were on the point. So besides this mom and cub, there were also, like I said, 2 or 3 other bears, and those other bears were just solo males. So there weren't any other females that were around over the course of the summer. And all of these bears were interested in this whale carcass, and they would actually manage to generally take turns. So when they finished having a meal, they would move off and another bear would come in. And the next slide actually shows 3 of them all together right around that carcass. And at various times, we actually saw 4 or 5 of them hanging around that carcass at once. So you can see there, the mother's looking a little bit defensive because that male got kind of close to her calf there. It was kind of close to her cub, but there was never any kind of fighting, though there were some charge activities that happened. So mom did charge towards that male a couple of times to tell him to back off and away from her cub. And little old cub just went right back to grazing on what was left of that beluga whale carcass. Now, on top of having to feed this cub, if you're a mom, how many cubs you have depends on what your body condition is. This mom had 1 cub. 1 cub is a relatively normal number. She might have had 2 as well, and occasionally we see triplets. But the thing is that if you're a mom and you've got only the 1 cub, it's kind of like being a parent with 1 kid. You're their whole world, and it's your job to entertain them and keep them busy and feed them and make sure they grow up to be the best polar bear they can be. And what this means, if you're a mom bear and you've got a little rascal trying to keep you busy like that, is number 1, her naps were always very interrupted. We could sit there and watch, and she would have to be following this guy around. But also, we saw a lot of really interesting sparring activity. So you can see here that their mom was trying to rest in the rocks, and the cub was just pouncing on her and biting her ears and rolling all over. And this activity would also extend into the water. So they would often go into the water both to cool off and to play around. We actually saw the cub trying to catch fish a couple of times. They certainly will eat them if they get lucky enough to catch one. I never saw the cub actually catch one, but sure did try a whole bunch. But you can see that they're putting their whole head in the water to visualize what's beneath them, and then popping up on occasion and getting a good look at us. And then they would go through again and tussle in the water. So that same sparring that you might get to see in the fall months is something that you may be lucky enough to see in the summer as well when it involves a cub. You generally wouldn't see adults doing this kind of behavior. They're just too big. They know to rest. They know to conserve their body mass and their energy for the fall. But a 7-month-old cub just has energy to burn and wants to be out there and trying everything around. So this was a great thing for them to be able to play in the water because it still helped keep them cool, kept them away from the bugs, and Junior still got to be entertained. So these activities that we were seeing went on for weeks and weeks, the entirety of the summer season. Nat Hub runs trips for about a month or a month and a half within the summer. While we certainly have summers where you might see a bear, you might not. This past summer was a really amazing one where I think every single trip saw these particular bears as well as other bears as well. And this cub was pretty good at putting on a show, no matter what else was happening around. So lots of rest for these cubs, this cub and the mom, but also a lot of playfulness. Now, this kind of behavior with bears resting and playing around when they're young will continue through the summer months. Getting into the fall, when we start looking at cooler temperatures and maybe not ice starting to form just yet, but perhaps the scent and the feel of cold weather and ice in the air. So I'm going to start just kind of by building us up to what the fall months are meaning for these bears as we move out of those summer months. And Eddy will take us through some of the stories from what this year's bear season looked like. So as we move through the summer and our ice-free months in July and August and September, in September, we start to see a move towards those fall temperatures and colors. We often see our first frost towards the end of August in Churchill. Bears at this point are still resting. They may be opportunistically eating, like we saw those bears who came across a beluga whale carcass, but your average bear isn't going to eat too much in September. There's simply not the platform for them to get their food off of. They may do things like eat some kelp. They may eat some berries if they get lucky and find some fish or are able to take a beluga whale. Overall, though, they are resting. However, as we start getting into October, the temperatures start to drop even further. And what's going to start to happen now is that the bears who have made their way off the ice for the summer, found a place to spend their summer months just being quiet and being by themselves for the most part, they're going to start to move back towards the coast to get ready for that ice that's coming. And they're going to stage close to the coast, and often we see them most often in that Churchill region and in that wildlife management area. Our season for polar bear viewing starts in early October and continues on through November, where as the season continues, you'll start to see more bears heading towards the coast. At the same time, any female that is pregnant is going to move away from the coasts. So if you recall what Eddy was saying before about mating season happening in the spring, so March, April, May, those females who have mated, if they're having a successful pregnancy and they've retained enough fats to carry themselves through a pregnancy, they are not going to be waiting for the ice to form because they've got to go have a baby instead. And what those pregnant females are going to do is instead move inland into that Wapusk National Park area where the denning zone is and get ready. They spend some time getting the den ready and walking around before going into that den for a period of around 3 months or so, where they're going to gestate, give birth, and keep their cub there for the first couple of months or so of their life. And in terms of when the ice comes in and when the bears leave, this is always different every single year. On average, though, the ice forms to the point where it can hold a polar bear's weight and the bears start to leave land, usually towards the end of November. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Eddy to talk about what this past fall was like for polar bear viewing and what kind of stories he's got there.
Well, thank you very much, Eleanor. I just wanted to say the pictures of those cubs, or the cub and the mom wrestling in the water, that was so cool. Like, what an experience. And I've never seen a cub of the year as rotund as that one. It was well fed.
He was very well fed.
Yeah.
Very well fed cub.
Yeah, light bulb with feet. That's so cool. So everybody, let's just kind of go back to this initial map where we can see kind of where everything is, where Churchill is and where our polar bear habitat is, that we go and look for bears. So again, around Churchill, basically to get out to the Churchill Wildlife Management Area, we drive for about half an hour in the mornings out towards the Wildlife Management Area, where we join our polar rovers. Each trip spends a varying amount of time on the polar rovers, but it's, full days out on the tundra, driving around looking for bears. And as Eleanor was describing, they're starting to make their way to the coast. I kind of, picture it as getting in line for the buffet of seals that's coming their way soon when the ice forms up. But basically, they're making their way to the coast, and bears start to form up in much higher density. And as the temperatures start to cool, they're much more comfortable kind of moving around a little bit more. And so it's kind of the perfect combination of temperature drop, location, and bears to provide us with a phenomenal opportunity to see them in their natural habitat. So just to give you an idea of the area that we do take people out, you can see in the bottom left corner there, we've got the Great White Bear Rover Launch. And then all of the red pathways are basically the routes that we can take with the 6-wheel drive polar rovers that take us out to look for bears. We don't need to go much further than this map to have a phenomenal experience, because those bears, when they are making their way to the coast, all the ponds that you can see in the picture, especially as we get towards mid-season, start to freeze up. The bears find comfort laying on those ponds, getting some cooling from the ice on those ponds, but also there's lots of difference in the terrain and areas for them to tuck away from the wind, hide out from the wind, and move around along the coast as they gaze longingly out at the Hudson Bay, waiting for the ice to arrive. So I'm just going to start kind of right at my first trip. So I did 5 trips this year. My first 2 were Tundra Lodge trips, and then my last 3, sorry, were photo trips towards the end there. But here we are. So mid-October is kind of when I rolled into Churchill, and I really like this picture. This is not a polar bear, for those of you who are wondering. It's a different species. This is a ptarmigan here, willow ptarmigan, and it just kind of tells you a little bit about, you know, where the season was at. So these birds, they have a molt that they go from kind of a rusty brown color, very much the color of the earth, to completely white in the winter. And this ptarmigan is mid molt, and so it kind of gives you an idea. This is when fall is really starting to turn from fall leaning towards winter, and the animals react and behave in such a way. But what I love about this time of year is the fall colors. And so some of my highlights, some of my guest highlights, is just quite simply the contrast of a white bear sitting on kind of that reddish purple tundra with all the fall colors. We have larch trees up there, or tamarack trees. They can have gold needles. All the willow leaves start to turn. All the leaves of all the different wildflowers and plants on the tundra start to turn. And you just get this really interesting time of year where some of my favorite pictures from the entire season came from. I mean, there's really not a bad time to take pictures of polar bears up there, in my opinion. But just, you know, this day here, this bear, we were at the Tundra Lodge. We were sitting there, kind of waiting or hanging out for the afternoon. And this female polar bear, I estimate she was about 4 years old, wandered on over and decided to take a seat in the tundra next to the lodge. So it was just such a beautiful scene with the mist and the rain, a light drizzle sitting there. She laid down on the tundra. You can, like, this is what I mean, you know, her fur is a little bit wet with that rain, and the colors of the tundra are just like, it's such a great contrast. And then she also came over and had a quick look up at us there, which I thought was pretty neat. And I love the way their feet, their bears, they walk with pigeon toes, so their feet kind of pointing inwards. And as you can see here, she's just standing there, pigeon-toed, having a look up to see what's going on in the funny machine on the tundra. Very cool. So now we'll kind of get into late October. So my second trip, this is when we really started to see the weather turn. So we had like 60-mile-an-hour winds this year. And folks, just so you know, the timing of this can really vary. Weeks on either side when we start to see the weather change. It depends on a much larger system and way of the weather and climate in Churchill, but it's, you know, this is what happened this year. It might not happen the same way next year. So anyways, like, yeah, October 28th, guaranteed blizzard? I don't think so, but occasionally it's right around kind of the same time when the weather starts to turn. The days get shorter and things get colder. So anyways, we had like 60-mile-an-hour winds for a couple of days with blowing snow, and suddenly, you know, Churchill, which was the beautiful autumn colors, was covered with a blanket of snow in a short period of time. Now, this bear here, we had one day where we were driving around on the tundra for 8 hours, and it was howling wind. And, you know, I tried my mightiest to convince people to go stand out on the back deck of the Rover when it's blowing, you know, 60 miles an hour and it feels like it's minus 30 outside. And those that did had a very nice experience. But, you know, the bears don't necessarily have the same adventurous spirit that we do for standing on the back deck. And so what they'll try to do is hide behind some willows. They typically find themselves a nice area of willows tucked in behind some the prevailing wind. So they're out of the wind, and then the snow kind of piles over and ends up drifting on top of them. And snow, being quite insulative, will land on top of the bears and provide them a nice nice warm blanket of snow to wait out the difficult weather. And so here we had a bear that was in the same place for the entire day. We drove past it on our way out, and we drove past it on our way back in. It stayed in the same place for the entire day, tucked out of the wind, getting buried in snow. But every so often, maybe every 10 minutes, it lifted its head just to have a look to make sure everything was going good. And bears are cat nappers, so they basically, they're not having a sound 8 hours worth of sleep. A resting bear will lay down, drop its head down, and maybe for every 5 to 10 minutes might lift its head up, have a look around, sniff around, see what's going on, and then put its head back down. But they basically are kind of constantly in this resting awareness state. Yeah, and here's just another bear that was actually on the other side of the rover. So we were kind of in between these two bears, one on either side of us, and they were both tucked up against the willows, letting the snow drift on them. And as they slept out the storm, not a bad idea. And that's exactly what we did when we went back to the Tundra Lodge. We got ourselves some hot cocoa and basically hunkered in for a howling, windy night. But it was pretty cool because it was kind of these 2 days was really the switch between kind of the fall colors to a cold kind of continuation for the rest of the season. The ponds you can see in behind this bear were starting to freeze. That temperature drop really did that. Just threw in some pictures of some other animals here. So we also had some Arctic fox moving about, and it was one of the only animals that was really running and moving during that extremely cold, windy weather. And they're extremely well insulated. Their fur is one of the best insulators on the planet, and of course high metabolism, running around looking for lemmings and all that kind of stuff. But they're pretty extraordinary critters and fun to see out on the tundra. Yeah, and I just threw this guy in here because this was kind of the first larger male that we did see come onto the scene, and he stayed in the same spot for a couple of days, kind of doing the same thing as those other bears, resting out of the wind, out of the blowing snow. But really, we called this bear Scarbrow, or that was kind of the name on the tundra, was Scarbrow, because of that very distinctive scarring above its eyebrow, or its eye there. And again, one of the ways you can kind of tell in close range between male and female without seeing their genitalia or kind of the guard hairs would be scarring on the face. Most often it's going to be the males that carry a lot of scarring on their face from that sparring, that competition that they have out on the sea ice for mates. They can also be competitive for food at times, but usually it's pretty negotiable unless they're extremely food stressed. And Scarbrow also, for looking like a real tough bear in that last slide with that scar and kind of the glare across the tundra, also partook in a little bit of polar bear yoga. So something that bears love to do, especially, I notice it almost like all the bears, as soon as the first good batch of snow hits in Churchill, we end up seeing polar bears just rolling around and getting their snow baths in. They're extremely clean bears. They like to keep their fur free of most odors and that kind of stuff. So they roll around in the snow, and it helps to keep them nice and clean, which is great. Let's see. And yeah, so we also started to see bears during this trip. The cold weather started to bring bears out that we hadn't seen yet. And so there's some bears that this bear we saw kind of on the way from the Churchill Wildlife Management Area back towards Churchill, just off the side of the road, walking across the rocks with those beautiful black spruce trees in behind. And then let's move to late October and early November. And we kind of had like a plateau. So we kind of had that cold snap, and then it just kind of plateaued for a little bit, slowly getting a little bit colder. And we started to see bears pop up and moving around a little bit more. When you are, as Eleanor said, when you're this bear that comes off the sea ice and you potentially got 500 pounds of excess weight, you're burning through around 1.5 pounds of that a day just to keep yourself alive. By the time you get to the fall, it's still warm for a polar bear. even if it's 40 degrees or 30 degrees Fahrenheit. It's still quite warm for a polar bear, and so they do like to have colder temperatures to move around a lot. So we kind of had it plateau a little bit below freezing, and bears started to move around quite a lot. This bear was one of the cleanest bears that I have ever seen. Extremely well maintained coat, but gave us a nice walk by on the tundra, which was quite nice. We also, as it was cold and we are on the edge of the Hudson Bay and we're in the subarctic, the weather didn't let up. We had some more blowing snow, but it also kind of started to bring out more bears. And we've mentioned sparring before. We saw, Eleanor showed you those pictures of the mom and cub sparring. I talked a little bit about the sparring that goes on during breeding season, but there's a very kind of special and unique behavior that does occur in Churchill that some groups are lucky to see, and that's when we get two bears or more bears kind of traveling together and hanging out together, socializing and playfully sparring. And so we started to see the evidence of this towards the end of October there this year, where we saw this. I think this was the first evidence that I really got that this was going on. Was I saw these two bears sleeping in close proximity together that were much too big to be polar bear cubs. So I'll just show you the next picture here, which was those same two bears. We saw them later in that day. They had moved a ways and they started to kind of get a little closer together, socialize a bit. You can tell kind of just how they're nuzzling. It's a very scent focused social behavior that's kind of the starting point for polar bear sparring. And move to the next picture here. Oh, and this is also the first trip or when we started to see mom and cub. Sometimes they're present earlier in the season, but for us, this is the first time in the season we got to see a mom with cub. And it was a mother with a cub of the year. And I just want to point out how much thinner she is and her cub is than the bears that Eleanor showed you. And that's because time frame wise, like even if they were the same condition, it's been 3 months where mom and cub have not had a proper seal meal being on land. And so this is, they're in fair condition. Mom is actually collared. I don't know if you can see that, but she's actually got a tracking collar on. And yeah, this is kind of the condition they end up being towards the end or mid fall. But mom here still has another, 5 weeks before she's out onto the ice hunting for ring seals. So good idea for her to conserve energy. And she really was. When we saw her, she was, being very, very calculated and careful, avoiding other bears and finding good, cool places away from other bears where she could rest and see a lot of the surroundings and smell a lot of the surroundings. And aha, here we are. This is the golden ticket. This is what we suspected was going to start happening as temperatures got cold and we saw the bears hanging out together, is we got ourselves some sparring bears. So sparring among polar bears is a social behavior. It's not extremely well understood, but it's thought there could be a couple of things. One of them is, these bears are waiting to go out onto the sea ice and they haven't been doing a whole lot for most of the summer. There is some sparring that occurs during the summer, but it's so hot. And so it's cooled down and it's kind of like the bears get their energy back, and among bears they may spar to kind of rejuvenate their muscles. But also bears being incredibly scent-oriented bear animals, there could be a little bit of kind of hierarchy work going on here where male bears are sparring. They're starting to get to know their competitors. They recognize a bear's smell. I always kind of compare it to human facial recognitions. Like if I didn't see Eleanor for 10 years and then I saw you again 10 years from now, I'd probably still know you're Eleanor based on your face, just recognizing you. That's how humans work. Bears, on the other hand, they are better off recognizing other bears by smell. And so by recognizing this other bear that they're competing with, they might remember that, that bear, it was very strong and I had no chance against it when we were wrestling this past fall. And so if they are approaching and they're about to have a conflict, a serious conflict on the ice, they may choose to avoid that bear as an energy conservation and as basically just well-being. Avoid the conflict if they don't need to have it, and maybe go look for, the scent of a bear, or, bump into another bear that they have competed with before, or maybe they don't recognize the scent of. So that's kind of the idea, is either it could be just getting things moving, out for getting things ready so they can start moving around the ice and getting those muscles back in order, or it could be kind of just sort of a bit of a social hierarchy before they head out onto the sea ice and have to compete. Very useful to avoid conflict, because you can imagine if 2,000-pound bears decided to fight for any reason at all, there'd be a lot more injuries. There'd be a lot more polar bear death, because one polar bear swat can easily break another bear's jaw. You can have blindings, ears being torn off, canines being snapped, that kind of thing. So it's something that, when it's a real conflict, happens quite selectively, and it's in the fall time. It's very important to note this is just playing, so they're not actually trying to hurt each other. Really cool. And I find most fascinating about it is this is also the sparring behavior they do is also towards the end of their fasting. So they've already burnt through that 500 pounds of fat that they gained, and they're running to the end of their supply, and yet they still have extra energy to go and play around and socialize. What that tells me about the behavior is sparring must be extremely important to their dynamic out on the sea ice, to their social dynamic out on the sea ice, to have to burn that energy so far into a fast. Anyhow, on to the next. Moving to early November, so trip 3 for me. Ponds are frozen. We're starting to see kind of bears out on the ice. Something about the previous slides there is bears were really delicate when they stepped onto the ice, but now it's been cold for a while. Bears are out onto the ice. There's still some snow blowing around and that kind of thing, but it's definitely a winter wonderland. We also got to see a mom with a couple of cubs show up. She stayed around the same frozen pond for 2 days, and similar to what Eleanor was seeing, is mom was having a hard time with one of these cubs that really wanted to fight. It really wanted to just like bite her ears and bite her butt and roll around on the ice with mom. And mom had a really great way of dealing with it, which was basically she'd just like push the cub. And of course the cub is small and on the ice, and the cub would actually like bum slide away from mom, basically just like pushing the cub. And didn't stop that cub from trying to wrestle with mom, but it was cool to see. We also had some more sparring bears show up, and so there was kind of a loose group of 3 adult males that were hanging around, and sometimes there'd be one having a nap on the other side of a snowdrift, and the other hand there'd be 2 that would come and wrestle, and they got into it pretty good on a frozen. Basically, their arena was a frozen pond and kind of the snowbanks around, and they just kind of stayed in the same area for a few hours, wrestling pretty close to our rovers, which was just a delight to watch. So powerful. And then we get to mid-November, and we're getting to my last trip. I flew home. Yeah, I think I got home on November 18th, but mid-November, we saw some really, really cool behavior in mid-November, because as we start to work our way towards the end of November, the ice is freezing, the ice is coming in. Not all of the bears are going to make it onto the sea ice. Western Hudson population, Hudson Bay population, if you have 850 bears and you have, only part of the ice or some ice is available for the bears, that's a pretty high density of polar bears competing in the same area. So a lot of bears are just like, you know what, I'm just going to hang back and not have to deal with these other bears. And so we have some bears head out onto the sea ice and some bears kind of hang back. And so we had some really, really phenomenal opportunities for watching bear behavior. There was one morning we watched, my rover watched one bear doing still hunting from the rovers. I had my camera set up with kind of the digital zoom on it, and we're just watching. It's right out of the edge of the ice, and it stood in the same place. We timed it together for 1 hour and 46 minutes. It did not move for 1 hour and 46 minutes. It just stood there staring at the water. And so what I suspect is at some point that morning, that bear had either seen a seal come up or was standing at a seal breathing hole or something like that. But there was enough evidence there for that bear to say, what I should do this morning is stand here for an hour and 45 minutes waiting for a seal to come up. It was unreal. We also saw a mom with cubs. This is, again, a good 3/4 of a mile away through the scope, right out at the edge of some ice. She saw a seal that was sleeping on the ice, and she took her 2 cubs and basically communicated to them the way that a female bear will communicate to her cubs, usually with like chuffs and kind of gentle breaths and stuff like that. And she had her 2 cubs cluster together and sit together while she went and started stalking the seal. And so her cubs, we tried to like kind of do the distance based on her body length, and it was 300 yards that she was away from her 2 yearling cubs. Or no, they were cubs of the year, sorry, her 2 cubs of the year. The cubs of the year like sat in a neat pile, and then mom basically wandered off 300 yards attempting to hunt a seal. It was really cool. This picture here, this is of a bear that we watched go all the way from out of the edge of the sea ice. So she probably was a mile away when we first saw her, and this is kind of a perfect example. We're guessing kind of in the 3 to 4 year old range. She's not a very dominant bear yet. There's limited amount of space on the sea ice, or it's a little more difficult to get to the sea ice. And she went out, kind of checked out the scene, and she came back in, and she walked all the way in, kind of looking at us. We were the curiosity, and I just love this picture. She just kind of like sat behind a little bit of grass, peeking up at us, and she stayed in the same posture, kind of like looking and smelling for a good 10 minutes. It was really fun to watch. Again, towards the end of polar bear season, we also had some other critters around. Arctic fox, again, I just love it. The Arctic fox here kind of got its nose tucked into its tail like a little muffler, helping to warm the air before it breathes it in. And then this is one of my favorite photos from the entire season. We've got a red fox jumping. It had been running around listening for lemmings, and it jumped up into the air, and it happened right in front of this very important mural painted by a local artist, Sandra Cook, in regard to truth and reconciliation and the residential school system in Canada, which is a very big conversation going on in Canada right now. But one of my favorite pictures from the season. There's a lot of meaning behind this. Also this time of year, you can see in the distance, we've got quite a lot of ice kind of coming in behind us, but also we had really a beautiful day with lots of hoarfrost, lots of moisture in the air settling on the trees, giving us this really wintry wonderland look. Very cool. And this is the bear that was still hunting. So after standing still for an hour and 45 minutes and then walking back in, it came here and napped. And so that evening, it was a very tired bear. That evening, we left, it had its head rested on this rock and it was napping. The next morning we came out, it only moved about 100 yards to a pile of kelp and was laying there having a nap. And this is that bear that had walked in all the way from a mile away to come check us out. We found out that she was, again, a young female. She was a little over 300 pounds, and she has scarring on her feet. We're not sure what from, but it could have happened when she was a cub, but it's old scarring. And then also, if you look just beneath her, in her ear, you can see there's a little white tag, and she has a satellite transmitter. So she's being tracked by one of the research organizations up in Churchill as well. Kind of cool. And with that, I think I'll pass it over to you, Eleanor.
Thanks, Eddy. Those are some great stories. Really happy to listen to those. So just to wrap up the year in the life of a bear before we hand things over for questions, what's going to happen with these bears as that ice continues to form is Hudson Bay will at some point be nearly 100% covered in annual ice, meaning that nearly the entirety of the bay will freeze completely over. That usually happens sometime early in January, so ice is still forming right now. And all of those bears that we've been talking about and all the bears Eddy saw in the fall are going to be moving out onto the ice as that habitat becomes available for them to be hunting, searching for those seals. Any pregnant females are going to move towards the inland areas in Wapask Park, where the cubs are going to be born sometime around the end of December or early January, so coming up in about a month here. And they will remain in the den for about 2 months, nursing their cubs before they emerge from their den with those really tiny fur balls that you see in calendars and postcards, and they're just the cutest things you've ever seen. They will take those very tiny fur balls, those cubs, off to the sea ice to go meet up with the seal pup season and get those easy meals to start feeding themselves again after a very, very long fast. So just a quick note of what you can see there in the image on the bottom right-hand side. That is what a newborn polar bear looks like. They are nothing like what you see when they emerge from the den. They are quite small, only about 1 pound in size, and quite helpless for the first couple of months or so. So in terms of where they are right now, as of a couple of days ago, the ice is starting to form. So we're seeing that same map that we saw earlier on in the presentation, where that light blue along Hudson Bay is the location of the sea ice. So we've seen the sea ice form kind of from the western side, moving out towards the center. And while there are still some bears on land, remember that is expected for pregnant females, the majority of them have now moved out onto that sea ice so that they can go out, go catch some seals, and begin to bulk up again so that when they come back off the ice in the summer, they're going to have the reserves to keep themselves throughout the summer during that fast. So with that, I guess we're going to wrap it up. And in conclusion, this is all just pretty neat, Eddy. Great stories. Lovely pictures.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, in conclusion, it is pretty neat. And I think that having the opportunity to go to Churchill and see polar bears kind of in this resting phase, and then kind of getting getting excited to head out onto the sea ice again is just a unique opportunity for anybody. And there's really not anywhere else where you can see bears in this way, in such a kind of organized and consistent way. It's really, really special.
It really is, and I think it's been a phenomenal year overall for viewings and for the bears themselves. They came off the ice in great shape, and you could see even through your images in the fall that they were still looking pretty good. So good year for the bears and great year for us too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right. Now, before we get into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to some of these questions. So we've seen some markings on the backs of some of these polar bears. Can you explain what those are? It's like a green dye.
Yes. So that was the last bear that I showed there. I don't think any of the other ones had it, but that bear. So the way that I found out how much it weighed, about the scarring and the satellite tag and all that kind of stuff, is basically it had been handled previously by the Polar Bear Holding Facility, and so it's a bear that maybe, or the Polar Bear Alert Program in Churchill. So it's a bear that maybe had an opportunity or decided that it was a good idea by following its nose to head into an area where there's a lot of people, and Conservation Manitoba decided that it was not safe probably to try to handle the bear without tranquilizing the bear. And so that bear has been processed through the Polar Bear Holding Facility, probably stayed there and then was released, but decided to not go out onto the ice, but rather stay on land. So that's where the green dot comes from. It's just a way to identify those bears from the air.
Do we know approximately how many bears there are in the Churchill population?
So the most recent estimate on the Churchill polar bear population is a few years old, but we're looking at approximately 850 bears within that larger Western Hudson Bay population. It does cover a fairly large area, so you're not going to see 850 bears on any one day. You'd have to spend a lot of time by helicopter searching for those bears, but in terms of the bears that regularly hang out around Churchill and the ones that you might be able to see by air, there's anywhere between 10 and probably 70 bears that would be within that larger area, which are all part of that Western Hudson Bay population.
Is there, if I'm coming to view bears, is there a better time of year to come, or in a worse time?
Ooh,
Ooh, getting
ooh.
down to the finer details. So, so here's, I mean, maybe Eleanor, but let me know if you think this is true or accurate as well. But definitely weigh in on this. But basically, polar bear season or polar bear viewing, when we run our polar bear expeditions between early October and later November, that is definitely your best time to see polar bears, and not only your best time to see polar bears, but also the best time to see polar bears potentially moving around and doing things other than sleeping. Of course, you can get that in the summertime as well. It's just a little more, sometimes the bears are in areas that are very difficult to access. They're very far away. I know I've been to Churchill in the summer a couple of years ago. Sounds like this year was a phenomenal year, but like in 2019, the only polar bear I saw was through a scope, kind of in early July there, and it was, yeah, a good mile away, sleeping, and it was sleeping in the same spot for many days. So it was like, yeah, we saw polar bear consistently, but you know, definitely, that's why we have polar bear trips. If you want to see a polar bear and that's what you want to see, the best time for sure is going to be October. I think it's like, yeah, October 10th to like November 22nd or something like that is our season.
Yeah, I'll
Very
just
good.
chime in with Eddy and say thumbs up to that. That while you may see bears in the summer, our summer trips do focus on other types of wildlife because, as Eddy was saying, the viewing opportunities in the summers are quite variable depending where those bears are and what the temperature is and all those other things going on. But you will also see beluga whales in the summer, so there's points for that too.
Yeah, won't get belugas in the fall. Well, probably not.
Probably.
So we saw, and we that a polar bear was eating a beluga whale carcass. Would they ever actually attack a living beluga whale if it got too close to the ice, for instance?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that we're still gathering more information on. So there's definitely, especially in areas further north where there's longer times of ice pack, there's lots of evidence that polar bears will hunt beluga whales when there's an ice entrapment. So as that ice grows in and beluga whales, being marine mammals, have to come up to breathe, that's a great opportunity when, for a polar bear, if you have a pod of beluga whales that are using a very small breathing hole, for the bears just to opportunistically take swipes at these whales and wear them out until they can pull one out. Beluga whales are quite a bit larger than polar bears. A big beluga whale is going to be more around 3,000 pounds, which is a big meal for a polar bear of any size. However, there's also been recent evidence of areas, even close to the Churchill area, where there are higher cliffs, that polar bears are actually hunting in the summer off these elevated cliffs, jumping down onto beluga whales that are in the river below, and there have been successful hunting attempts that way as well, which these are not things that we have seen around Churchill. These are things that like Parks Canada and people who live on the land have come back reporting, but just to know that this is happening is pretty wild and fantastic.
Great, thanks for addressing that. So let's talk about the polar bear's feet for a second. It kind of looks like they're pigeon-toed. Can you explain why that is? Is it because they're so big, or does it give them some advantage to swimming?
Sure. I think it's just because it looks cute, honestly. That's why. No, basically it has to do with their locomotion. So polar bears are the ultimate calorie counter. They basically are trying to conserve energy in every single way that they can. If you can imagine life on the sea ice, you know, their ranges can be 3,000 kilometers squared to up to 1,000,000 kilometers squared. So they're moving extremely far distances. And being a bear that weighs, you know, anywhere from 500-600 pounds to 1,500 pounds, sometimes upwards of 2,000 pounds, your entire skeletal system needs to be extremely well adapted. Your entire body needs to be extremely well adapted for locomotion. And so having the feet kind of pigeon-toed allows them to just kind of maintain an excellent locomotion. Their feet, the back feet, often kind of swivel around and land in front of each other, and so it's just kind of, it's part of that. They don't need to have this forward-facing toes for that. They kind of do this. It just makes it a lot smoother, a lot easier, more ergonomic for their body, perhaps, to travel. It's a calorie-saving kind of bone structure situation. My understanding.
Great, thank you. Well, unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'm going to throw it back to you guys for any closing comments you may have for us.
Well, I'd just like to thank everybody for tuning in today and letting myself and Eddy have an opportunity to talk with you about bears. It's always something that we're very happy to chat about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Really fun to be here and to co-present with you, Eleanor. And I hope y'all are enjoying the holiday season, and we'll see you next week at some point, I'm sure, or next couple weeks.
Thank you both for taking the time to present for us today. And I would also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Now, join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We will see you next time.